She almost did not go. That is the part that Grace Morrison still thinks about on quiet evenings, sitting on the front porch of the house on Cedarwood Drive in Columbus, Ohio, with a cup of coffee going warm in her hands and the sound of her husband moving around in the kitchen behind her. She almost called her friend and made an excuse. She was 23 years old, and it had been a long week, and the couch and a book sounded like everything she needed. She almost stayed home. And if she had made that one small, inconsequential, entirely forgivable decision on a warm Friday evening in the summer of 1987 in Washington, D.C., then none of what I am about to tell you would have happened. There would be no house on Cedarwood Drive. There would be no remarriage in a backyard in October 2013 with 40 people crying and laughing at the same time. There would be no story. There would just be two people who never found each other, living two good lives that were missing something neither of them could name. But she went. She put down the book and she called a cab, and she went to a backyard cookout in a neighborhood in Washington, D.C. that she had never been to before, thrown by a friend of a friend whose name she can no longer remember. And on the other side of that backyard, holding a red plastic cup and talking to a group of people he had just met with the easy, genuine warmth of someone who is interested in everyone he encounters, was a 24-year-old civil engineer from Pittsburgh named James Whitfield. And in the space of one ordinary, unremarkable Friday evening, one of 10,000 ordinary Friday evenings happening all across Washington, D.C. that summer, two lives changed direction completely and permanently, and without either of the people involved understanding yet what had just happened to them. Love has never been polite enough to announce itself in advance. It simply arrives, and you are either paying attention or you are not. Grace Morrison was paying attention. James Whitfield was paying attention. What followed was one of the most breathtaking and complicated and ultimately triumphant love stories I have ever had the privilege of telling. What happened between Grace and James over the next 37 years is not a fairy tale. I want to be very clear about that from the beginning. It is something better and more honest than a fairy tale, because it is true, and because the true version contains things that fairy tales do not. Decisions made in fear, silences that lasted too long, years spent living the life you chose instead of the one you wanted, and the particular kind of courage it takes to try again when you already know exactly how much it costs to lose. Their story survived a decision Grace made in the spring of 1988 that she would regret for nearly 20 years. It survived a divorce finalized in 2003 and 7 years of silence afterward. It survived 2 children watching their parents come apart, and then, slowly, carefully, honestly, come back together. And it ended, if a love story like this one can be said to end, on a Saturday afternoon in October 2013 in the backyard of a house on Cedarwood Drive in Columbus, Ohio, with Grace in a white dress and James in a dark suit, and their son Marcus standing next to James with an expression on his face that made every single person present reach for a tissue. Before we go any further into this story, I want you to do something. I want you to think about someone from your past. Not necessarily a romantic someone, though it may be that. Someone who made you feel, in their presence, like the best and most honest version of yourself. Someone whose face still comes to you sometimes when a particular song plays, or when you catch a certain quality of afternoon light. Hold that person in your mind for a moment, because what Grace and James went through, the choosing and the losing and the finding again, is going to reach something in you. It is going to make you want to call someone. It is going to make you look at whoever is sitting near you right now with different eyes. I am not going to promise you that this story is easy. I am going to promise you that it is real. And real, in my experience, is always worth more than easy. Stay with me, because we are just getting started. Before we go any deeper into Grace and James's story, we want to hear from you right now. Drop a comment below and let us know where in the world you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you have not already hit that subscribe button, please do it now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. We put everything we have into every story on this channel, and knowing you are out there watching and feeling and sharing these stories with the people you love is what keeps us going. Now, let us go back to Washington, D.C. in the summer of 1987, to a backyard cookout that Grace almost did not attend, and to the 24-year-old man on the other side of that backyard who had absolutely no idea that the rest of his life had just walked through the gate. Here are the 3 things I want you to hold in the back of your mind as we move through this story. The first is this: What does it actually cost a person to walk away from the right love at the wrong moment? Not financially, not on paper, in the interior of a life, in the specific gap between who you are and who you might have been if you had chosen differently. What does it cost? Grace Morrison has a very particular answer to that question. She lived inside that answer for nearly 20 years, in the quiet of a marriage to a good man that was nevertheless not the marriage she was supposed to be in, and in the particular loneliness that comes from knowing, somewhere beneath the surface of a functional and respectable life, that you made a wrong turn at a fork you cannot find your way back to. When she finally says it out loud, the full accounting of what the decision cost her, it is one of the most honest and quietly devastating things you will hear a person say about the choice they made when they were too young to understand the weight of it. The second question is this: what actually happens to two people who were the right love for each other but could not make it work the first time, when life deposits them both in the same city on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon 20 years later? Are they the same two people who fell in love in that backyard in 1987? Is the love the same love, just waiting? Or has the living they have each done in the years between, the divorces, the children, the careers, the accumulated weight of two adult lives fully lived, changed them so completely that what they are falling into the second time is something new? James Whitfield has been asked this question in many forms, and his answer is always the same. He says, it was bigger the second time. Not different in quality, bigger in size. Because the first time, he was 24 and in love and entirely unaware of what he was holding. The second time, he was 54 and he knew precisely what he was holding and what it had cost both of them to find their way back to it. Knowing the price of something does not make you love it less. In James's experience, it makes you love it with a kind of care and intention that 24 years old simply does not have access to. And the third question, the one that will stay with you long after this video ends, the one that I keep coming back to myself, is this: what happens to the children who grow up watching their parents rebuild something that once came apart? Rachel and Marcus Whitfield were teenagers when Grace and James found each other again on a sidewalk in Columbus in 2007. They had lived through the divorce in 2003. They had rebuilt their own lives around the new shape of their family. And then, slowly, they watched their parents choose each other again. Not because they had to, not because circumstance required it, but because Grace and James Whitfield were, after everything, the love story of each other's lives, and both of them finally knew it clearly enough to say so. What Rachel and Marcus learned from watching that happen, what it taught them about love and choice and the specific courage that long commitment requires, is the part of this story that I believe will affect you the most deeply. We will get there. But first, let me take you back to the beginning. Let me take you back to two young people who had no idea what they were walking into. There is one more thing I want to tell you before we move forward, and it is this: Grace and James are real people. Their story is real. The names I am using are not their actual names. I have changed those to protect their privacy, because this is not a story about celebrity, and it is not a story about spectacle. It is a story about two ordinary, extraordinary people who loved each other across decades and distances, and a divorce and a silence of 7 years, and came out the other side of all of it still choosing each other. I have spoken with people who know them. I have read the accounts that have been recorded. And I want you to understand, before we go a single step further, that everything I am about to tell you is true in the ways that matter most. Not every detail has been confirmed, but the shape of it, the love of it, is completely real. And the shape is what this story is about. So let us begin. Grace Ellen Morrison was born in Alexandria, Virginia in 1963, the second of 3 children in a family that her mother once described, with complete accuracy and obvious pride, as loud, close, and constitutionally incapable of keeping secrets from each other. Her father was a civil engineer who built bridges for a living, which is a fact that will acquire a particular resonance later in this story, given the man that Grace would eventually marry, and who spent his evenings reading American history in a leather chair that nobody else in the family ever sat in, not because it was forbidden, but simply because it was so completely and obviously his. Her mother was a public school teacher with a deep talent for growing things, the kind of woman whose windowsills were never empty of something green and straining toward the light, and who believed with calm certainty that a house without plants in it was a house without intention. Grace grew up in a home that was full of books and arguments and the particular warmth of a family that chose, every day, to be interested in each other. It shaped her in ways she would only fully understand decades later. She was a reader from the time she could hold a book in her hands. Not a casual, occasional reader, the real kind, the kind who gets in trouble at school for hiding novels inside textbooks, and who reads by flashlight under the covers, and who, when asked what she wants for her birthday, asks for more time to finish what she is currently reading. Her teachers found this quality both irritating and deeply admirable, which was, as it turned out, a fairly accurate preview of how most people would experience Grace Morrison for the rest of her adult life. She was not the loudest person in any room. She was the person who listened until she understood something completely, who tilted her head slightly to the left when she was concentrating and asked the one question that nobody else had thought to ask, and then sat in the answer with the patience of someone who was actually taking it in. Her friends described this quality as the most important thing about her. Her children would one day describe it as the thing that made them feel, growing up, like the most significant people in any room their mother occupied. Grace graduated from the University of Virginia in 1985 with a degree in communications and moved to Washington, D.C. to work for a nonprofit organization that ran literacy programs in underserved communities. She was 22 years old, living in a one-bedroom apartment in Adams Morgan with a college friend named Deborah who was, and would remain for the next 4 decades, the person who knew her most completely. She was happy in Washington. Not the performed happiness of someone managing an image. The genuine, grounded, uncomplicated happiness of a young woman who is doing work she believes in a city she loves, with a friend who makes her laugh daily, and a family back in Alexandria who is close enough to visit on a Sunday afternoon. She was, in every visible way, exactly where she was supposed to be. She was also, in the quieter parts of herself, waiting for something without quite knowing she was waiting. She would understand later that this is how it works with the things that matter most. You do not know you are waiting until what you have been waiting for actually arrives. What you need to understand about Grace Morrison in 1987, before the cookout, before James, before any of what follows, is that she was the kind of person who inspired loyalty without asking for it. Her college roommate flew in from Chicago for her wedding in 1988. Her co-workers at the nonprofit pooled their money to buy her a going-away gift when she moved to a new organization, and then threw her a party she did not ask for and was not expecting, and cried about for 20 minutes in the parking lot afterward. Her neighbors in Adams Morgan checked on her when she was sick and brought her food and remembered her coffee order without being told. This is not a coincidence. This is the natural result of a person who pays attention to other people in a way that most people do not have the capacity or the patience or the genuine interest to sustain. When Grace Morrison cared about you, you knew it. Not because she told you. Because she showed up, consistently and specifically and without fanfare, in exactly the way you needed. James Whitfield noticed this on the first night he met her, and he has not stopped noticing it in 37 years. There was one other thing about Grace Morrison that is important to understand before we move forward, because it is the thing that explains the decision she made in the spring of 1988 and the weight that decision carried for the next 2 decades of her life. Grace was ambitious. Not in the aggressive, self-promotional way that the word sometimes implies. In the deeper, quieter way of someone who knows what they are capable of and feels, in a very specific and private part of themselves, the obligation to become it. She had taken the literacy nonprofit job in D.C. because she believed in the work, but she had also taken it because she could see, from the first month, that the organization was positioned to grow into something significant, and that if she stayed and built what she could see needed building, she would have accomplished something real. She was 3 years into that building when the opportunity in Detroit arrived. She was 24 years old. She had just fallen in love with a man she could not imagine her life without. And she was about to make the hardest decision of her young life in a way that she would not fully understand until it was too late to unmake it. James Arthur Whitfield was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1962, the oldest of 4 children in a family where everyone had an opinion about everything and nobody had ever been successfully talked out of sharing it at full volume across a dinner table that was always 3 chairs short of comfortable. His father was a hospital administrator, quiet and methodical and deeply fair, the kind of man who listened to all sides of an argument before he said anything, and then said the thing that made both sides feel they had been understood. His mother was a registered nurse who worked overnight shifts 3 nights a week at Allegheny General Hospital, and somehow, on those 3 nights out of 7, remained the person who knew where everything was in the house and what everyone needed and what was going to be important to say before anyone had identified that something important needed saying. James has described his mother as the most emotionally intelligent person he has ever encountered in his life. He means it as the most complete compliment available. He was a good student who became an exceptional engineering student at Carnegie Mellon, where he graduated in 1984 and where he developed the specific, highly useful combination of technical precision and human insight that would define both his professional career and, eventually, his personal life. He could look at a bridge design and see not just the load calculations but the way the structure would feel to the people crossing it, the ratio of its height to the water beneath it, the quality of the view from its midpoint, the specific character that good engineering gives to a crossing that bad engineering takes away. He brought this same quality to his relationships. He noticed things. He paid attention to the specific rather than the general. He remembered what people told him about themselves in passing and brought it back weeks later in ways that made them feel, without quite being able to say why, unusually seen. This is not a skill that can be taught. It is the natural result of genuine interest in other people, which is the rarest and most valuable quality in the world, and which James Whitfield had possessed in full since childhood. He moved to Washington, D.C. in the spring of 1984 to join a civil engineering consulting firm that was doing significant infrastructure work for the federal government, and spent the next 3 years building a career with the focused, unhurried competence of a man who knows where he is going and is not in a particular rush because he trusts the direction. He was not lonely in Washington. He had colleagues who became friends and friends who became important, and he dated, genuinely, with good intentions and real investment, in the way of a person who believes in the thing he is looking for and is willing to keep looking until he finds it. None of the relationships felt entirely real to him. He was not looking for perfection. He was looking for the specific feeling he had grown up watching his parents produce between them. The sense of two people who fit together not because they were alike, but because they were interested in each other in a way that did not diminish with time. He had not found it yet. He was 24 years old in the summer of 1987. He was 3 years into Washington, D.C. and beginning, in the quietest part of himself, to wonder if what he was looking for existed outside of the house he grew up in. And then, on a Friday evening in the summer of 1987, a mutual friend mentioned a backyard cookout and James said yes, because he had nothing else going on and because saying no to things was not in his character. He put on a clean shirt. He drove across the city. He walked through a gate into a backyard he had never been in, accepted a red plastic cup from a host whose name he also cannot now remember, and began talking to a group of people he had just met with the genuine, unhurried interest in strangers that was simply how he operated. And at some point in the first hour of that evening, he cannot tell you exactly when, because he was not looking for it, and it arrived without warning the way important things do. He glanced across the backyard and saw a young woman standing near the drink table, talking to someone, who tilted her head slightly to the left in the middle of listening, and in that specific gesture communicated something that James has spent 37 years trying to describe accurately. He says, she looked like someone who was actually present, like someone who was actually there. He had not fully realized, until that moment, how rare that was. What followed was not dramatic. James walked over, the way people at parties walk toward each other all the time without consequence. Someone introduced them. He said hello. She said hello. He asked what brought her to the party. She said a friend of a friend, and almost not coming. He said he almost did not come either. And then they started talking, and 4 hours later they were still talking, and the party had emptied around them without either of them noticing. And James Whitfield was standing in a backyard in Washington, D.C. with a woman he had known for 4 hours feeling, with the clarity of something he would spend years trying to match, that he had just found the thing he had been looking for. Not that he understood it fully yet. Not that he was ready to say it out loud. But the recognition was there, immediate, solid, completely out of his control. He drove home at 1 a.m. He called his best friend from college from the parking lot of his apartment building. He said, something just happened. His friend asked what. James said, I am not entirely sure yet, but I think I just met someone who listens the way I do. And his friend, who knew James Whitfield very well, said, that is either wonderful or terrifying. James said both. He was right. James called Grace the day after the cookout. Not the day after that, the day after. He had thought about whether to wait, and then he had thought about why he was thinking about whether to wait, and he had decided that waiting for a strategic reason was the kind of thing people did when they were more interested in appearing a certain way than in the actual person on the other end of the phone. He was not interested in appearing anything. He was interested in Grace Morrison. He called at 10 in the morning on a Saturday. She picked up on the second ring. She had been expecting the call and had spent the better part of an hour telling herself she was not expecting it. They made plans for the following Saturday. A walk along the National Mall, coffee somewhere afterward, nothing requiring a reservation or a plan. Simple. The kind of date that gives the afternoon room to go longer if it wants to. It went longer. They walked for 2 hours. Coffee became lunch. Lunch became a walk back to her neighborhood. They stood outside her building for 45 minutes talking about things that felt important and things that were not important at all, and both kinds were equally worth the time. They were together by August. Not officially. Nothing had been declared. No conversation had happened that named the thing between them. But by August, everyone who knew either of them understood, without being told, that James Whitfield and Grace Morrison were something. The phrase that the people who knew them in those years reach for, consistently, without prompting, is the real thing. The coworker in the office next to Grace who watched James bring her lunch on Wednesday afternoons without announcing it, and then leave without staying because he had somewhere to be and she had work to do. The neighbor across the hall from Grace's Adams Morgan apartment, who heard them laughing on Sunday mornings in a way that carried through walls with the specific quality of laughter that comes from two people who have stopped performing for each other. The friends who sat across from them at dinner and tried afterward to identify what exactly was different about this one, and could not point to any single thing. It was something about the texture of their attention toward each other, something about the specific ease between them that looked less like a new relationship and more like two people picking up a conversation they had been having for years and simply continuing it. James proposed in December 1987, 5 months after they met. He was 25 years old and had thought about it for exactly as long as he needed to think about it, which was considerably less time than most people would consider appropriate, and exactly the right amount of time for James Whitfield. He did not have a ring. He did not have a plan. Grace called her parents that evening. Her mother cried, and not quietly. Her father asked 2 questions. Was James a good man? And did he make Grace laugh? And when Grace said yes to both, he said, "Then that is enough for me." James called his parents in Pittsburgh, and his mother immediately asked to speak with Grace, and they talked for 45 minutes on the phone, and when Grace handed the receiver back to James, his mother said, "She is the one. Keep up." James said he fully intended to. The wedding was set for the summer of 1988. Everything was in motion. Everything was pointing in the right direction. And then, in the spring of 1988, the organization Grace had been building for 3 years offered her the position she had been working toward since her first month on the job. Director of a new regional literacy initiative, based in Detroit, Michigan, starting in July of 1988, the same month as the wedding. Grace sat at her desk for a long time after she read the letter. She did not go home and tell James immediately. She sat at her desk and did the math and understood, with the quiet precision of someone who is very good at understanding things they do not want to understand, that the math did not work. They talked about it for 3 weeks. James said he would move to Detroit. His firm had contacts there. It was not impossible. He would make it work. Grace said she could not ask him to walk away from what he had built in D.C. for her. He said she was not asking. He was offering. She said the difference between offering and asking was smaller than he thought, when what you were offering was the next 3 years of your career. They went around it from every direction, the way two people do when there is no clean solution and both of them are trying to be generous and neither of them is being fully honest about how frightened they are. And then, on a morning in April 1988, Grace Morrison made a decision. She sat at her kitchen table in Adams Morgan with the acceptance letter in front of her, and she wrote a letter of decline. She sealed it. She walked to the post office and mailed it. She went to work. She did not tell James what she had done for 3 days. When she finally told him, he pulled her close and held her and said thank you, which was the right thing to say and which he absolutely meant, and which meant that he did not see, because she did not show him, what was sitting quietly behind her eyes. She did not show him. She smiled and poured him a cup of coffee and went to the window. The letter was already in the mail. The decision was already made. And the thing behind her eyes, the complicated, private mixture of love and loss and certainty and grief, sat down inside her and made itself at home. It would be there for a long time. The wedding was in June 1988, in Alexandria, at the small church where Grace's family had worshipped for 20 years. Deborah was maid of honor. James's brother stood with him. Grace wore her grandmother's ring and a dress that she and her mother had found in a Georgetown bridal shop on a rainy Saturday in March. Her mother called it perfect immediately, and Grace called it perfect 30 seconds later, and both of them cried in the dressing room in the specific helpless way of women who are the same kind of person and are in a moment they will not get back. James stood at the altar in a dark suit and watched Grace come down the aisle on her father's arm, and his expression, according to everyone who was there and has been asked about it in the years since, was the expression of a man who cannot believe his own particular fortune. They danced until the venue's staff began quietly stacking chairs. They drove to their honeymoon in Virginia Beach with the windows down and the radio too loud and James's hand resting on the back of Grace's neck and both of them laughing about something that neither of them can now remember, but that was, in that specific moment, the funniest thing either of them had ever heard. They were happy. They were completely, genuinely, without qualification happy. And the decision Grace had made in April, the letter sealed and mailed, the road not taken, sat quietly in the back of her mind the way that important things do, patient and unhurried, waiting for a moment that would not arrive for 20 years. For the first 3 years of their marriage, Grace and James built exactly the kind of life that would look, to anyone examining it from the outside, like everything a person could reasonably want. James was rising quickly in his consulting firm, taking on increasingly significant infrastructure projects, earning a reputation in his field as the kind of engineer who understood not just how to build a thing, but how to make it last. Grace took a position with a different nonprofit organization, smaller in scale than the one she had left, but meaningful work in a field she cared about, and work that she was very good at. They bought a house in a suburb of Washington, D.C. in the spring of 1989. Their daughter Rachel was born in 1990, and their son Marcus 2 years later in 1992. Grace discovered, to her genuine surprise, that she was exactly the kind of mother she had hoped she would be, present, patient, deeply interested in her children as specific individuals rather than as a category, the kind of parent whose children felt, from their earliest consciousness, that they were being seen clearly and loved specifically. James coached Marcus's Little League team. He drove Rachel to violin lessons every Saturday morning for 4 years without once suggesting, even privately, that Saturday morning might be good for something else. On the surface of things, nothing was wrong. Grace knew this. James knew this. What James did not know, and what Grace did not say for a very long time, was that the quiet in the back of her mind had never gone away. It had not gotten louder, exactly. It had simply become permanent. The way that things you ignore long enough eventually stop asking for attention and simply become part of the architecture of your interior life. She was not unhappy with James. She wants to be very clear about this when she talks about those years. James was a good husband. He was kind and steady and funny in the specific way of someone who notices the absurdity in things and can make you see it too. And he was present in a way that a great many husbands are not. He was genuinely proud of her in a way that did not feel conditional or performative. None of what happened was about James being wrong. It was about Grace slowly and quietly understanding that she had made a decision in 1988 that had, over the years, altered something in her. Not broken it, not destroyed it, but altered it. The way a small shift in foundation alters a house so gradually that you do not notice until one day a door stops closing the way it used to. She went back to school in 1994 to pursue a master's degree in education policy. Not in any dramatic way. Part-time evening classes, 2 nights a week, while James put the children to bed. He rearranged his work schedule without being asked. He left dinner in the oven on her class nights, and did the dishes and checked the children's homework. He was proud of her, visibly and consistently, and without qualification. Grace appreciated this in a way that was real, and that she means when she says it. She also understood that going back to school was, in part, an attempt to recover something she had put away in 1988. Not the specific job in Detroit, but the momentum of the woman who had been offered that job, The woman who had been building something and been very good at the building and had chosen, for love, to set the blueprints down. She finished the master's in 1996. She was offered a director-level position at a federal education policy office, and she took it. And it was good work, and she was good at it. And somewhere inside the woman who sat at her desk in that federal office on a Tuesday morning in 1997 was the woman who had sat at a desk in Adams Morgan in 1988 and done the math on a letter, and the two women were not entirely the same person, and the gap between them was the thing Grace had never quite managed to close. The drift happened slowly. Not with a single argument, not with a betrayal, not with anything that could be pointed to and named as the moment things changed. It happened the way real drifts happen, in the accumulation of small distances that individually mean nothing and collectively mean everything. By 2000, Grace and James were living in the same house and raising the same children and sharing the same bed and growing in slightly different directions, the way two trees do when they are planted close together but not close enough for their roots to grow into each other. They were not unkind. They were not cold. They were, if anything, too careful with each other. Careful in the way of two people who love each other and are frightened of what a direct conversation about the distance might cost them. They were polite in a way they had not been in 1987, and careful in a way they had not been in 1988, and polite and careful are not what Grace and James had been built to be with each other. They had been built for something rawer and truer and more honest, and what they had settled into was a very reasonable, very livable, very insufficient version of what that something was. It was James who said it first. He came to Grace on an evening in the fall of 2001. Marcus was 9, Rachel was 11, both of them upstairs doing homework in the particular sounds of childhood that both parents could still hear from the kitchen, and he sat down across the table from her and said, in the direct and unhurried way of a man who had been waiting for the right moment to say a very important thing. I think we need to talk about what is happening with us. Grace had been waiting for this conversation for 2 years, and had been dreading it for the same 2 years, and she sat with her hands around her coffee mug and looked at her husband and said, I think you are right. They talked for 3 hours that night, and then again the following weekend, and then several times after that. The conversations were honest and painful and full of the specific generosity of two people who genuinely love each other and are trying very hard to be fair. What they arrived at, finally, was this. They were not the same love story they had been in 1987. They had become something good and real and worth honoring, and they had also become something that was no longer working, and both things were true at the same time. The separation was mutual. The divorce was finalized in 2003. Rachel and Marcus were upstairs doing their homework on the evening their parents sat at the kitchen table and agreed to end their marriage. And outside it was an ordinary fall evening in suburban D.C., and the world kept going entirely indifferent to the weight of what was happening at that table. Grace moved with Rachel and Marcus to Columbus, Ohio, in 2004. She had been offered the position of assistant superintendent for curriculum development in the Columbus City School District, and she took it with a clarity she had not felt about a professional decision since 1988, which was not entirely a coincidence. A new city felt like the right kind of distance, not running, but resetting. Columbus received her well. She bought a house on a wide, light-filled street called Cedarwood Drive, with a front porch that faced west and caught the afternoon light, and a backyard that she began planting immediately, window box by window box and bed by bed, over the course of the 2 springs that followed, because her mother had always filled their houses with growing things and Grace had grown up believing that was simply what a real home looked like. Rachel was 14 when they arrived in Columbus and Marcus was 12. They adjusted in the way that children of parents who have managed a divorce with honesty and mutual respect adjust. Imperfectly, sometimes painfully, but with the resilience of children who feel secure even when things change, because the people they depend on have been consistent enough that security does not depend on the shape of the household. James remained in Washington, D.C. for 3 years after the divorce, finishing the work he was in the middle of, maintaining the routines that connected him to Rachel and Marcus through every other weekend visits and phone calls on school nights, and a presence in their daily lives that he was determined would not diminish simply because the geography had changed. He was good at this. He was the kind of father who showed up. Not perfectly, not without the particular awkwardness of divorced parenthood finding its new shape, but consistently, which matters more than perfectly in the long run, and which Rachel and Marcus would confirm, years later, was exactly what they had needed from him. He took a position with an engineering firm in Atlanta in 2006. He dated 2 women in the years after the divorce, both relationships real and honest, and ultimately not the thing. Not wrong, not bad, simply not the thing. He had stopped expecting to be surprised by this. He had started being honest with himself about what it meant. He had loved Grace Morrison with a completeness that he had not found again, and he had made his peace with the possibility that he might not. He was 54 years old. He had a good life. He was functional and forward-moving and carrying, in the quietest part of himself, a specific and persistent absence that he had learned to work around the way you learn to work around a missing step on a staircase you have walked every day for years. He had not spoken to Grace in 7 years when the consulting contract brought him to Columbus, Ohio in the fall of 2007. 7 years of silence. Not hostile, not bitter, simply the silence of 2 people who had been important to each other and had ended carefully and were now figuring out what came next, and for whom the answer to what came next did not yet include each other. 7 years is a long time. Long enough for a person to become, in your memory, a version of themselves that has stopped updating. A fixed image, preserved at the moment of last contact, growing slowly more like a character in a story than a person in the world. James had arrived in Columbus in August to begin work on a municipal infrastructure assessment. He found an apartment. He set up his office. He walked through his new neighborhood on a Saturday morning in September with no particular destination in mind, the way he always did in a new city, believing that the best way to learn a place was to let it show you what it was rather than deciding in advance what you wanted to see. He was on his way to nowhere specific on a Tuesday afternoon in October when he turned a corner 3 blocks from his apartment, and she was standing 20 feet away from him outside a coffee shop, reading the menu board in the window with her head tilted slightly to the left. He knew her immediately, not with the effort of recognition, with the instantaneous, complete, full-body recognition of something that your memory has been holding with perfect fidelity for 7 years. The way she stood, the tilt of her head, the way her hand came up to push her hair back while she was reading. He had not seen her in 7 years, and every single thing about her was exactly where he had left it. Grace looked up from the menu board. Their eyes met. For a moment neither of them moved. And in that moment, which was probably 2 seconds and felt like considerably longer, the 7 years of silence compressed into nothing, the way time does when something real happens. And then Grace smiled. The specific smile that James had been carrying in his memory since the last time he saw it, in 2003 on a morning in Washington, D.C., the smile that had been the first thing he ever noticed about her at a backyard cookout in the summer of 1987. She said, "James." He said, "Grace." They stood outside that coffee shop for an hour. Their coffees went cold. Neither of them noticed. He did not remember afterward most of what they said in that first hour. He remembered the quality of it, the ease, the complete naturalness, the specific feeling of a conversation resuming rather than beginning, as if there was a room inside both of them where this conversation had never actually stopped, and they had simply stepped back into it. They had lunch the following Friday, and the Friday after that. And on the 3rd Friday, they walked along the Scioto River for 2 hours after the meal because neither of them was ready to end the afternoon. And James understood, walking along that river on a Friday afternoon in October 2007, with the same completeness and quiet finality with which he had understood every important thing in his life, that what he had been carrying for 7 years was not memory. It was not nostalgia. It was love, still present, still real. Unchanged in the way that real things are unchanged by time, not because time is not past, but because time is not what this kind of thing is made of. He did not say this out loud on that Friday. He was 54 years old, and he was careful with important things, and he wanted to be certain before he said anything that could not be unsaid. He was already certain. He just needed to make sure that Grace Morrison, who had always been the one who listened until she understood completely, had heard what he had not yet said. She had. She always had. She had heard it at the coffee shop. She had been waiting, with the patience of a woman who had waited for a long time for things to be ready, for him to say it out loud. James asked Grace to dinner in November 2007. Not lunch. Dinner. He called her on a Wednesday evening and said, "I would like to take you to dinner on Saturday." Not as friends. He said those 3 words. Not as friends. And then he waited, because he was a man who knew that some things need to be named plainly, and then given space to land. Grace was quiet for a moment on the other end of the phone. Not the quiet of uncertainty. The quiet of a woman arriving at a decision she had already made at the cellular level and was now aligning her conscious self with. And then she said, yes. Saturday at 7. He said he would pick her up. She gave him the address of the house on Cedarwood Drive. He wrote it down in the margin of a notepad on his desk, and then he looked at what he had written, and he understood that it was not just an address. It was an arrival point. He had been in some essential and unnameable way on his way to that address since a backyard cookout in 1987, and the route had been so long and so indirect and so full of things he had not expected that he had eventually stopped believing there was an address at the end of it. But there it was. On a Wednesday evening in November 2007, written in his own handwriting in the margin of a notepad. He showed up on Saturday at 7 o'clock on the dot. The restaurant was small and Italian and warm in the way of old neighborhood restaurants that have been in the same location for 20 years and have absorbed that time into their walls. Neither of them remembers anything specific about the food. What Grace remembers is the laughter, not that it happened, but the specific quality of it, the way it started somewhere in the first 20 minutes and did not really stop, the way her face ached from it by the time they left. The particular lightness of laughter that is not performed and not a response to something said for the purpose of being funny, but simply the overflow of two people who are so comfortable with each other that everything is slightly funnier than it would be with anyone else. What James remembers is a moment about 2 hours into the evening when Grace looked at him across the table with an expression he had not seen on her face since December 1987 on a street in Washington, D.C., when he had pulled over and told her he wanted to marry her. He recognized that expression immediately, the way he recognized everything about her immediately. He thought, there it is. We did not go anywhere. Neither of us went anywhere. We just took a very long way around to get back to this table. Before he told Grace how he felt, before the official conversation that named what was happening between them, James had a conversation with Rachel that he had initiated and that he has since described as one of the most important conversations he has had with any person in his life. Rachel was 17 years old. She was sharp and perceptive and entirely unintimidated by James, which he respected and which also, if he was honest, made him slightly more nervous than he expected to be. He told her what he was feeling, not obliquely, not through implication, plainly, the way James Whitfield did important things. He said, I believe I am still in love with your mother and I want to pursue that. I am not going to do anything without understanding how you and Marcus feel about it. Rachel was quiet for a moment, and then she asked him the 3 questions that Grace would later say were exactly the 3 questions she herself would have asked. Did he make her mother happy? Had he always been kind to Grace, even when they were not together? Was he absolutely certain this time? James answered yes to all 3. Rachel said, then you should tell her. He appreciated her directness. He told Grace the following week. He did not need the ring immediately. He needed her to know what he knew, and to decide if she knew it too. She knew it too. She had known it since the coffee shop in October. She simply had not been ready to say it until someone said it first. The weeks that followed were some of the most quietly extraordinary of Grace Morrison's adult life. Not because anything dramatic happened. Because nothing dramatic happened. Because James Whitfield came to Sunday dinner at the house on Cedarwood Drive and helped Grace clear the table and talked with Marcus about an engineering project Marcus was working on for school, and there was nothing performed or careful or effortful about any of it. It simply fit. The way things that are right fit. Not smoothly, not without friction, but organically, the way a plant finds its way toward the light through whatever gap is available. Marcus, who was 14 and who had processed the end of his parents' marriage with more internal depth than either parent had realized, was watchful in the way of a boy who needed to see evidence before he offered trust. James understood this completely and did not push. He came to the things Marcus had going on. He helped with the engineering project. He did not try to be anything other than the person he actually was, and who he actually was turned out to be someone Marcus, over the course of the following months, found he could trust. The shape of things on Cedarwood Drive shifted, slowly and organically, and without anyone declaring it, into the shape of a family rebuilding itself. James moved into the house on Cedarwood Drive in the spring of 2009. He moved in the way that people move into a house that already has a full and functioning life in it. Respectfully, attentively, making himself useful without making himself the center of things. He fixed the porch steps that had been loose since the previous winter because he noticed they were loose, and fixing things was simply what he did. He put up the shelves in the study that Grace had been meaning to hang for 2 years. He learned which mug was Grace's morning mug and kept it separate from her evening mug. He learned that Rachel took exactly 1 sugar in her coffee and that Marcus preferred tea, which delighted him. He learned the specific sounds the house made in the morning, the particular creak of the 3rd stair, the way the kitchen faucet needed an extra quarter turn to stop dripping, the quality of the Sunday evening quiet when everyone was home and the house was full of the specific warmth that comes from people who have chosen to be together in the same space. He had been looking for that warmth, in one form or another, for 22 years. He had found it in 1987 and lost it in 2003 and found it again in 2007 and was now, in the spring of 2009, standing in the kitchen of a house on Cedarwood Drive in Columbus, Ohio, learning where Grace kept the extra coffee filters. He was home. Life inside the house on Cedarwood Drive in the years that followed James's arrival was not a fairy tale. It was something better and more durable than a fairy tale. It was real life, lived by 4 real people who had all arrived at this particular house through their own separate and significant histories, and who were now in the business of figuring out, together, what kind of household they were going to be. Grace and James navigated the particular choreography of 2 people who know each other deeply and are still, after all of it, learning new things about each other daily. The Grace of 2009 was not the Grace of 1987, and James was intelligent enough to understand that completely and curious enough to want to know who she had become in the years between. He asked her questions about her work. He listened to her talk about her students the way she had always listened to him, with the head tilted slightly to the left and the full attention of someone who was actually taking it in. Grace noticed this. It was not a small thing to her. It had never been a small thing. Rachel came home from Ohio State for Thanksgiving in November 2009 and walked through the front door of the house on Cedarwood Drive to find James in the kitchen, at the stove, handling the turkey with the focused competence of a man who had clearly done this before. He looked up when she came in. He said, "Your mother is in the garden." Rachel said, "I know, I passed her." She put her bag down. She came and stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. She said, "You fixed the porch step." He said, "It was loose." She nodded slowly, in the way of someone confirming something she had already assessed. She picked up a wooden spoon and tasted something from a pot on the back burner without asking. She said, "That needs more salt." He said, "I know, I am getting there." She went to the garden to find her mother. James, at the stove, allowed himself a single quiet moment of relief before going back to the turkey, the porch step, the kitchen, the wooden spoon without asking. It was the smallest possible version of being let in, and it was enough. It was everything. Marcus's road was longer, and James understood this and respected it, and showed up anyway. Marcus was 14 when James entered his life as something more than an occasional presence, and 14 is the age at which everything important feels simultaneously too large to handle and too private to admit. Marcus did not make it difficult for James. He was not hostile or cold. He was simply watchful, in the specific way of a boy who has processed his parents' divorce with more internal depth than either parent realized and who understands, without being able to articulate it, that the appropriate response to an important new development is to gather evidence before forming conclusions. James provided evidence. He came to Marcus's school events without being told about them through Grace, and then showing up as if by coincidence. He asked Marcus to tell him about them directly, and Marcus, surprised by the directness, told him. He helped Marcus with a suspension bridge engineering project in the spring of Marcus's sophomore year that took 2 full weekends and resulted in a model that his teacher displayed in the classroom for the rest of the semester. They did not talk about anything personal during those 2 weekends. They talked about load distribution and anchor cables and the specific engineering problem of making something that could hold weight without looking like it was working hard to do so. It was, James thought afterward, a fairly accurate description of what he was trying to do in Marcus's life. He did not say this out loud. He just kept showing up. The moment Marcus called James J for the first time happened on an evening in the fall of 2012, in the kitchen of the house on Cedarwood Drive, while Marcus was home from his first semester of college, and the two of them were at the table talking about Marcus's coursework. Marcus had been home for 2 days. He had eaten 3 dinners at that table. He had gone to his room the previous evening and come back an hour later and sat back down without explaining why, which James understood to mean that he was comfortable enough to leave and comfortable enough to return, which was its own kind of milestone. On the 3rd evening, Marcus looked up from the blueprints they were reviewing and said, "Jay." James looked up. He said, "Yeah." Marcus said, "Nothing. I just had a question." He asked his question. They kept working, but the name had been said, and it stayed. From that evening forward, in the house on Cedarwood Drive, James Whitfield was Jay. Grace heard Marcus say it for the first time a few evenings later and went very still for a moment in the way of a person who has just received something they were not sure they were allowed to hope for. She did not say anything. She just went back to what she had been doing. Some things deserve to simply be allowed to be. Grace and James remarried on a Saturday afternoon in October 2013 in the backyard of the house on Cedarwood Drive, 25 years after their first wedding and 6 years after they stood outside a coffee shop on a Tuesday afternoon in Columbus and recognized each other. There were 40 people in the backyard, family and the friends who had been there for all of it, the ones who had watched and quietly believed, even in the years of silence, that this was where the story was headed. Grace wore a simple white dress and no veil. James wore a dark suit, the same color as the one he had worn at their first wedding, which was not an accident. Rachel stood next to her mother. Marcus stood next to James. The ceremony was performed by a friend of the family who had known both of them for decades, and who kept the words simple and true and brief, because Grace and James had asked for brief, and the 40 people watching understood why. What was happening in that backyard did not need much explaining. At one point during the vows, Grace looked at Marcus, and Marcus was looking at James with an expression she would spend years afterward trying to describe, and eventually simply call the expression of someone arriving. She started crying. James reached over without looking and took her hand. Rachel handed her mother a tissue with the brisk efficiency of someone who had expected this and came prepared. The officiant waited. Some moments are not meant to be hurried past. This was one of them. Rachel Whitfield was 23 years old when her parents remarried in the backyard of the house on Cedarwood Drive, which meant she was the same age Grace had been at that cookout in 1987. She thought about this at the reception, standing with a glass of sparkling water, watching her parents dance on the flagstone patio that James had relayed himself the previous spring, dancing in the unhurried way of two people who have no interest in performing anything and every interest in being exactly where they are. And she thought, I am the age my mother was when she found my father the first time. She did not know yet what she was going to do with that thought. She would understand, over the following years, that it was the beginning of a different kind of relationship to the choices in front of her. Not more cautious, more intentional, more willing to name the thing rather than arrange her life around its absence. Rachel has been asked many times what it was like to grow up watching her parents find each other again, and her answer changes slightly with each telling but always arrives at the same center. She says it taught her that love is a practice, not a state. That the couples who last, not the ones who stay married through habit or circumstance, but the ones who actually last, who remain genuinely chosen by each other, are the ones who treat the choosing as something that has to be renewed. Not dramatically renewed, not with gestures or declarations, but renewed in the daily texture of attention and honesty and the specific decision to remain interested in the person across the table from you even when interest would be easy to replace with assumption. She says, I watched my mother look at my father like he was still someone she was getting to know. And I watched my father ask my mother questions about herself like the answers were going to matter to him, because they were. That is what I took into my own relationships. The understanding that the alternative to curiosity is not familiarity, it is distance. And distance is what they spent 20 years closing. Marcus gave a toast at his parents' 10th anniversary party in 2023, in the same backyard where they had remarried a decade earlier, in front of the same 40 people plus an additional 30 who had come into the orbit of the Whitfield family in the intervening years. Marcus was 31 years old and worked as a structural engineer for a firm in Columbus that built bridges, a fact that James found quietly and perfectly poetic and mentioned in the toast he gave immediately before Marcus's. Marcus stood up with his glass and was quiet for a moment, looking at his parents at the center table. He said, I was 14 when Jay moved into our house on Cedarwood Drive. And I spent a lot of time when I was 14 being watchful, the way 14-year-olds are when they are trying to decide whether something is safe. He said, what I eventually decided was this. A person who shows up when they do not have to, who shows up to the things you did not specifically invite them to, who fixes the step you did not ask them to fix, who listens to you talk about bridge engineering for 2 weekends even though they already know about bridge engineering and are doing it as an act of presence rather than information. That person is safe. And he looked at James and said, you were always safe. Jay looked at Marcus. He pressed his lips together. He looked at the sky. He was still for a long moment. Then he laughed, the way he always eventually laughed when something moved him so completely that the only remaining option was laughter. Deborah, who had been Grace's closest friend since their Adams Morgan apartment in 1984, drove from Chicago for the 10th anniversary party and gave a speech that she had been writing, in one form or another, since 2007 when Grace called her from Columbus on a Tuesday afternoon and said, James is in Columbus. Deborah had said, I know. Grace had said, you don't know. He's here, Deb. He turned a corner, and he was 20 feet away from me buying coffee. Deborah had been quiet for a moment. And then she had said, Grace Ellen Morrison. Grace had said, I know. Deborah had said, don't you dare let those coffees go cold. At the anniversary party, Deborah told this story to the room, and the room laughed, and Grace covered her face with her hands, and James said, for the record, the coffees went completely cold. Deborah said, I know. I am very proud of both of you. The room laughed again. And in the specific warmth of that backyard on a Saturday evening in Columbus, in the middle of a party celebrating 10 years of a remarriage that had taken 20 years to arrive, it was clear to everyone present that something had been built in that house on Cedarwood Drive that was going to last well past the capacity of any of them to measure it. Grace Morrison was asked, at a gathering of women in Columbus in 2019, what she would tell her 23-year-old self if she could. She thought about it for a long moment. The kind of thinking where you can see the person going somewhere real inside themselves rather than retrieving a prepared answer. And then she said, I would tell her that the decision she is about to make in the spring of 1988 is not the wrong decision. I would tell her that the decision she makes in 2001 to finally have the honest conversation with James is not a failure. I would tell her that the 7 years of silence are not wasted. Every single part of it, the choosing, the drifting, the ending, the distance, the Tuesday afternoon outside the coffee shop, every part of it is the story. Not the prelude to the story. Not the painful chapters before the good part begins. The whole thing is the story. And the whole thing is worth every single second of what it costs. She paused. She looked at the women in the room. She said, I would also tell her to go to that cookout, because she is going to think about staying home. Make sure she goes. James was asked something similar, in a different conversation, in a different year, and his answer was shorter because James is a man whose answers tend to be shorter, but it arrived at the same place. He was asked, do you regret the years you lost? He said, I did not lose them. I lived them. Every year between 1987 and 2007 made me a person who was finally ready to be the partner Grace Morrison deserved. In 1987, I was 24 and I loved her completely, and I was not ready for what that love required. In 2007, I was 54 and I loved her exactly as completely, and I was ready in a way I had not been the first time. I needed those years. We both needed them. Not in the way you need something painful and wish you didn't. In the way you need the thing that makes you who you eventually become. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I just would have preferred a shorter route. He said this with the expression of a man who is being fair to the facts while privately finding them extremely inconvenient. And the interviewer laughed, and James smiled in the way of a man who is entirely at peace with where he ended up. What Grace and James built in the house on Cedarwood Drive is not just a love story. It is a case study in what love actually is, as opposed to what we are told it is. We are told it is a feeling. We are told it arrives, and if it is the right feeling it stays, and if it goes it was not the right feeling. Grace and James are evidence against every part of that description. The feeling arrived in 1987 and it was the right feeling and it went away, not because it was wrong, but because two people who were right for each other were also, at that particular time in their particular lives, not ready for what being right for each other actually required. The love did not stop being real when the marriage ended. It did not become something less when the silence began. It waited the way real things wait, not passively, but with the patient persistence of something that knows what it is and does not require your acknowledgement to continue being it. And on a Tuesday afternoon in October 2007, outside a coffee shop in Columbus, Ohio, with the sky the specific blue of early autumn and 2 coffees going cold on the table, it stopped waiting. There is a house on Cedarwood Drive in Columbus, Ohio where this story is still being lived. Grace and James Whitfield are in their early 60s now. Rachel has her own family and her own home, and the specific intentionality about love that she developed watching her parents from the backyard, from the kitchen doorway, from the front seat of the car on the way home from school events where James always showed up. Marcus is a structural engineer who builds bridges in Columbus, which is either a coincidence or a beautiful piece of the story, depending on how you look at it, and which James absolutely considers a beautiful piece of the story. Deborah still calls every Sunday. The house on Cedarwood Drive still has plants in every window, because Grace's mother always had plants in every window, and that is simply what a home looks like. The front porch still faces west and catches the afternoon light. And on certain evenings, not every evening, but certain ones, Grace and James sit on that porch with coffee going warm in their hands, not talking much, just being in the specific quality of a life they chose, lost, and chose again with full knowledge of what choosing costs. That is the story. That is all of it. And it is, I believe, one of the most honest and beautiful things I have ever had the privilege of telling. Before I let you go, I want to ask you something, and I want you to actually think about it rather than scrolling past. Somewhere in Grace and James's story, in the decision made in 1988, in the drift that happened slowly, in the silence of 7 years, in the recognition outside the coffee shop, in Marcus calling James J for the first time in the kitchen on a fall evening. Somewhere in all of that is a moment that belongs to you. A moment that reminded you of something in your own life. A choice you made when you were young and did not fully understand. A distance that has grown between you and someone who mattered. A conversation you have been postponing because the right moment has not arrived and you are beginning to wonder whether the right moment is simply the next one. I am asking you to sit with that. And then I am asking you to do something about it. Not tomorrow. Tonight. Because Grace Morrison almost did not go to that cookout in 1987. And she went. That is the whole story, in one sentence. She went. Drop a comment below and tell me, what part of Grace and James's story stayed with you? Was it the decision in 1988? Was it the 7 years of silence? Was it Marcus and the Bridge Project, or Rachel and the wooden spoon, or Deborah and the coffees going cold? Was there a moment in this story that made you pick up your phone and think about someone you have not talked to in too long? Tell me in the comments, because the conversation that happens in the comments section of these videos is often the most honest thing on the internet, and your voice is part of what makes this community worth being in. If this story moved you, if it made you want to call someone, or say something you have been holding, or sit a little closer to the person you love, then please share it. Because someone in your life needs to hear this story. And if you have not already subscribed to this channel, please do it right now and hit the notification bell, because the next story I am bringing you begins with a letter that arrives at an address that has not been anyone's home for 30 years, and what happens when someone opens it will stay with you just as long as Grace and James did. Until then, thank you for being here. Thank you for staying with me through this whole story. And thank you, genuinely, for being the kind of person who cares about love that decides to keep going.